I sing. Please be seated. Thank you.
Good morning. Justin, I appreciate you coming and sharing those things about what's going on in Ecuador. And I don't know if I've ever been a part of a church that was more excited about a mission point that they have than this church is about that. When people come back from Ecuador, the stories they tell, and it's life-changing for them. And so it's a blessing for us to be able to be involved in that with you. My son, yesterday, we're going to be leaving after the invitation song, so don't be looking for us afterwards. We're going to be on our way to Gulf Shores, Alabama for a week's vacation. And I was talking to my son on the phone yesterday, and he said, Dad, why don't you switch things around and turn the tables on everybody and have the communion after the sermon, and then you can leave after the sermon's over? But I decided not to do that. And David, I couldn't help. I've been looking over at you the last couple of weeks. That's going to be the most spoiled grandkid in the history of the world. I can guarantee you that. Well, there was a famous painting by the Renaissance artist Quentin Macy's that's entitled The Moneylender and His Wife. And you can go ahead and put that up if you want to. This painting confronts us with the choice that every one of us has to make between God and money. And I want you to notice a couple of details about this picture. The moneylender's sitting at his home, and in front of him you can see that there's a pile of coins, and he's got a scale there in front of him, and he has one coin in particular that his interest is really drawn to. His wife, on the other hand, she's sitting next to him, and she is leafing through a Bible. But even as she's leafing through the Bible, her gaze goes to the coin that's in her husband's hand. And Macy's point was to show how easily money can pull our souls away from God. And I think everybody in this room knows that tension, especially in our society. Would you not agree? We all live within that tension. Because we know that God demands our highest allegiance. And I would guess everybody in this room believes that there's nothing more precious than the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet we are so easily distracted. And in today's text, in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, the preacher wants to help us win our spiritual struggle with materialism by showing us the vanity of money. And in this passage we're going to be looking at, there's a word that does not even occur one time, and yet it's the underlying theme of this whole message, and that is contentment. What we learn is that contentment is not a goal for us to live for or to strive for, but rather contentment is the byproduct of living a life that is in pursuit of God. And so the preacher begins by pointing out the economic injustices that are built into the structures of government, the structures of society. When he says in verse 8, if you see the poor oppressed in a district, and justice and rights denied, do not be surprised at such things. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others higher still. The preacher, we're assuming he wrote this around 900 BC. But I want you to notice how contemporary the things he's talking about are. He points out something that we all see. We see the oppression in our society. We see the injustices in our society. And we see that whether we come from a communistic country or a socialistic country, or dare I say, even from a capitalistic country. We see this, don't we? Somehow the poor always end up on the bad side of the deal. And the preacher tells us not to be surprised by that, because it's built into our political systems. He's not excusing this kind of injustice. He's saying it's just part and parcel with living in a broken world. And our experiences all leads us to expect corruption at every level of government, don't we? We're not surprised when we hear about it. We all know the irony of the statement, I'm with the government and I'm here to help you, right? And fortunately, our founding fathers recognized the brokenness of humanity, and so built into our system is this checks and balances between the different branches of our government. Now, that hasn't solved the problem, but it does at least put some obstacles in the way of corruption. But until Jesus returns and makes all things new, we're going to see people buying their way to power, and we're going to see people abusing the system for their own benefit. But then the preacher brings the discussion down to a more personal level in verse 10 when he says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. Here is a well-established truth. No matter how much money a person has, they're never satisfied. I'm going to quote from several industrialists this morning, and the first one, you've probably heard this quote many times, but John D. Rockefeller was once asked, how much money is enough? And he said, a little bit more than you have. This guy was the first billionaire in the world. Taking it to a much higher level, Homer Simpson. By the way, I have never seen an episode of The Simpsons, okay? I know that makes me a really weird person because it's been on 80 years? But Homer Simpson once said to his boss, Mr. Burns, you're the richest man I know, to which Mr. Burns said, yes, and I would trade it all for just a little bit more. The contemporary author Jesse O'Neill has diagnosed this spiritual problem, and we've even seen it come up in a court case recently in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. She has tagged this problem affluenza. She says that affluenza is an unhealthy relationship with money. And I hope that everyone in here is at least open to admitting that every one of us has at least a small case of this disease. That all of us struggle with the disease of affluenza. Even if we're thankful for what we have, there is still somewhere in our minds a desire for what we don't have and trying to figure out how we can get what we don't have. It's been called acquisition without satisfaction. And this appetite that we have is never satisfied. The only way to curb this appetite is to be content with what God provides. Rather than always craving more, to be happy with less. Because we know that Jesus is enough. And the quest for this contentment, it's a lifelong struggle. Because the fact that I resist the temptation of materialism today doesn't keep materialism's temptation from being there for me tomorrow. I find myself a lot like the Beatles, who one day could sing, I don't care too much for money, and the next time we're singing, money don't give anything, it's true, but what it don't get, I can't use. Now give me money. That's what I want. Well, the preacher warns us that living for these things is meaningless. And to help us avoid coming down with a really bad case of affluenza, he gives us several reasons why it's meaningless. First of all, he says, others will try to take it from you. He says, as goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit, go to the next slide. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? There are always others who want to get a piece of your wealth. The government, children, scam artists. And the more a person has, the more people come out of the woodwork wanting to get what they have. And that in itself, as a result, makes it hard for that person to really enjoy what they have. He's going to say in chapter 6 and verse 1, I've seen another evil under the sun, and it weighs heavily on mankind. God gives some people wealth, possessions, and honor, so that they lack nothing their hearts desire, but God does not grant them the ability to enjoy them. And the strangers enjoy them instead. This is meaningless, a grievous evil. So first of all, he tells us that others can take it from us. Secondly, he says it'll keep me up at night. He says the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. Now, Solomon's speaking in generalities here, okay? This obviously is not the case 100% for one side or the other. He's speaking in generalities. As a general rule, people who work hard, especially who work hard physically, are ready for a good night's sleep. And they don't have enough money to really get them into a whole lot of trouble. And so they work hard all day, they come home, they eat, they watch a little bit of TV, they get in bed, and they sleep well at night, in general. But in general, on the other hand, the rich often have trouble sleeping. And Solomon kind of jokingly says maybe it's because of the rich diets they're eating and they get indigestion. Derek Kidner, in his book Message of Ecclesiastes, takes a look at all our modern exercise machines and health clubs, which, by the way, I'm not against those, okay? I have my own exercise machine. But he makes this observation. He concludes that it's one of our human absurdities to pour money and effort just to undo the damage of money and ease. But in addition, the rich have to worry about what's going to happen to their money. They have to worry about how they're spending their money. They have to worry about what the market's doing. They have to worry about identity theft. They have to worry about security issues. And wealth generally does not give rest. And so, quoting from another industrialist, Henry Ford once said, I was happier when I was doing a mechanic's job. Well, third, we're told that it's here today, but it may be gone tomorrow. Some of us nearly saw that happen in 2008, didn't we? He says, I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners, or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there's nothing left for them to inherit. Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. This too is a grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart. And what do they gain since they toil for the wind? Now, the language here, in particular in verse 15, might sound familiar to you, especially if you're familiar with the book of Job, because Job says this, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. You might say this is the naked truth right here. And Paul applies this same truth in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 7 when he said, for we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. How many of you know that and believe that? But we still just don't seem to live it, do we? It's like we're going to be the exception or something. This is a stark reality that every one of us must face. So what gain is there in living for money? And unfortunately, many, if not most people, are not going to discover this truth until they're lying on their deathbed. How much money will a rich person take with them? None. Not one dime. And so better for us to listen to the wisdom of the preacher right here. In fact, the only time God personally calls anybody a fool in the whole Bible is in a parable that Jesus told. And you know the parable of the foolish farmer. Luke chapter 12. And this is what the farmer says. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? As Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 16 says, all the amassing of fortunes it's like sandcastles. And not only will they elude us in eternity, but verse 17 says that it can rob us of the joy that we have today. In fact, all of what the preacher has to say about money and the pursuit of money is kind of summed up in verse 17 when he says, all their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger. This is the result of greed right here. Worry and sickness and anger. And the miser will end up alone, living in spiritual darkness, plagued with many anxieties. The ungodly pursuit of money takes a physical toll on a person, and it leaves people bitter. Have you ever known a happy miser? Anybody? Well, another industrialist, Andrew Carnegie, said millionaires seldom smile. Money can't console us when we're lonely. Money can't console us when we get a bad health prognosis. Now, it sounds like everything we're saying says money is bad so far, right? But there is some good news. There's a better way to live. And might I remind you that this better way to live is coming from the lips of one of the richest men in his day, okay? So it's not like it's wrong to be wealthy or it's wrong to have money. It all has to do with the way we look at it. And so he says, this is what I've observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them. For this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift from God. Here the preacher is giving us a balanced view of things, a God-centered view. He says that we should not see wealth as the pursuit of our lives. Rather, we should see wealth as a means to do good and as a means to bring enjoyment to life. And he again tells us the truth about finding joy in the everyday things of life, the small things like work and enjoying a good meal. This theme occurs throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and we've seen it a couple of times already, and we're going to see it again. They're sometimes referred to as the enjoyment passages. The preacher reminds us that joy is real and that time is short. And whatever time we have left is a sacred gift. But I want you to notice as the preacher discusses the meaninglessness of money in verses 8 to 17 that we've already looked at, I want you to notice God is not mentioned one time in those verses. But then when we get to verses 18 to 20, God is mentioned over and over again. Obviously, whatever enjoyment the preacher finds is a God-centered enjoyment. Without God, life is meaningless and miserable. But when we know the God of joy, even money can become a blessing. Earlier, the preacher's given us reasons why money and chasing after money is meaningless. And now, all of a sudden, verse 19, he's telling us that if we're wealthy, we should enjoy it. It sounds like a huge contradiction. But I want you to notice where the power of the enjoyment comes from. It comes when God is in the equation. Both having things and enjoying things are gifts from God. And if God is absent, then nothing is going to satisfy us, least of all money. The world that God created is full of His rich gifts for us. But the power to enjoy those gifts does not come from the gifts themselves. James put it this way in James 1:17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. And so the ability for us to enjoy wealth, and the ability for us to enjoy good food, and the ability for us to enjoy friendship, and the ability for us to enjoy sex, and the ability for us to enjoy any good gift comes from the Father. And anyone who does not have joy in their lives are looking in the wrong places. The preacher tells us to depend upon God for our joy, rather than depending upon any of His gifts. And the person who learns that lesson well, here's what the preacher has to say about them. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. Don't you love that? When we learn to enjoy God, we experience so much joy that life's short vanities are all but forgotten. And so a rich industrialist was horrified one day to find a fisherman sitting with his feet propped up next to his boat on a sunny afternoon. And so the industrialist said to him, "Why aren't you out fishing?" And the fisherman said, "Well, because I've caught enough fish for the day." He said, "Well, why don't you go out and catch more fish?" "What would I do with them?" He said, "You could sell them and earn more money, and then you could buy a bigger boat and go into deeper waters to catch more fish. And then you could buy nylon nets and catch more fish and make more money. And then you could buy more boats and you could hire people to do the fishing for you and make more money. And soon you'd be as rich as I am." The fisherman said, "What would I do then?" The industrialist said, "Well, you could sit down and really enjoy life." The fisherman said, "I'm already doing that." Now, the point to that story, and I want to be careful with this, the point to that story isn't to knock having ambition or being visionary or pursuing something better. The meaning of that story is to remind us that money does not buy happiness. And the truth is, the most content people in this world, and this is not simply a coincidence, the most content people in this world are also the most grateful people in the world. They go hand in hand. Paul, listen to what Paul had to say in 1 Timothy 6. And you're going to hear a lot of the preacher from Ecclesiastes in these verses. The verses we've just looked at today. Listen to what Paul says. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And then you go down to verse 17, same chapter. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the purpose of life is not prosperity, as many of us have been led to believe, but the maturing of the human soul. And so I want to go back to that painting by Macy's for just a moment. There is a subtle, striking detail that I did not mention to you just a minute when we opened a while ago. Because if you look down toward the bottom of the picture, just to the right of the Bible that the lady is reading, I'm talking about from her right, you see this oval mirror. And this mirror is reflecting the window that is in the room. And what is the shape that is in that window? I'll help you. It's the cross. And you may have trouble seeing it from where you are, but can you tell that there is an image of a man down at the bottom of that oval who is actually reaching out for that cross? It's believed that Macy's was painting himself into the picture. And he was making a statement by doing that. It's a reminder for us not to look for money to give us any satisfaction in life. Instead, we are invited to reach out for the cross, where Jesus gave his life even for our greed and materialism. And holding on to him, we can find full satisfaction. And that is guaranteed. Because as we're going to sing in just a moment, you can have this whole world. Just give me Jesus. And some of you need him in your life today. You're trying to live life without him. And if you've never been baptized, I want to encourage you to come and be baptized into Christ and have him as a part of your life, filled with the Holy Spirit. Some of you need to deal with the issue of materialism because it's eating your soul. And maybe you want to come and confess that and have us pray about that, or you can go to room 102 and pray with an elder and his wife about that. But let's stand and sing this like we mean it. Just give me Jesus.